Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today it's my pleasure to host actually my first taekwondo practitioner on this series, Scott Duncan. Scott is the Managing Director and co-founder of Aspire Executive Search. We had an experience a couple of years ago where Scott helped us find a new CEO for our organisation, and it really brought home to me the value of using an executive recruiter. And of course, as bread and butter of an executive recruiter, you're understanding job descriptions, understanding roles and who you're recruiting for. So sure. Welcome, Scott. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Great to talk to you. My first question for you, I'm going to ask you, what is the job of a CEO?
Well, on one hand, it's very simple. The job of a chief executive is really everything. I suppose ultimate accountability for the performance of the organization really falls on the chief executive's shoulders. But if you wanted to get a little bit more granular, I think really there's a huge piece around strategy. There's a huge piece around leadership of people, leadership of culture, leadership of operational performance as well. I think if I scratch a little bit beneath the surface though, what we tend to observe is the chief executive role is a big job. It's a massive undertaking that can be really quite all-consuming, and arguably, depending on the organisational size, no one person can actually do everything with an organisation. So increasingly, I actually see the role of a chief executive is actually recruiting and leading a high-performance executive team, and so. Over the years, we've helped all sorts of people into chief executive roles, either, experienced chief executives potentially making a move or people stepping up into the gig. And, without a shadow of a doubt, when we see people step up, you almost see them visibly age before your eyes. So they get, a little grey or a little bit more haggard, certainly in the initial phase, before they get that support network of executive leadership around them. And then life becomes a lot easier when you've got good people working with you. So I think chief executives should really stay focused on elevating themselves above the detail. And, it's almost the working on the business as opposed to working in the business.
Yes,
if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So, and as you say, having that balanced team that they recruit or that is, in some cases, some of them will already be there, that covers the different areas of the business, your technology and your people and your operations and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. You need some deep functional expertise. But I think increasingly at the executive level, what you're looking for is a team of high-performance utility players. Because I think as you become more experienced or more senior, hopefully the skill set or the capability set becomes more transferable across, functional areas.
Yes.
But yes, life gets a lot easier when you've got great people supporting you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so when you recruit for a CEO, what skills and experience do you look for?
Well, that is very contextual, depending on the organisation, what might be happening in the broader competitive or operating environment, where that organisation might be from a maturity perspective as well. So it's a little hard to answer that in a blanket way. What I think is really, really important though is when you're recruiting a chief executive is to take a huge amount of time in the consultation process around determining what are the competencies that will be critical to success for this person in this organisation. So again, often when we are engaged to find chief executives, we will not overinvest, but spend a huge amount of time with various stakeholders at the front end of the process to make sure that there's some clarity, some definition, but some broad alignment around what the priorities will be, for the organisation, for the role, and then that kind of segues down into what is the skill set that we're seeking. So we will often, interview each board member individually. We will often interview potentially the incumbent if it's appropriate, maybe members of that executive leadership team, and then almost workshop the feedback or the responses we get to make sure that there is that clear sense of alignment at the start of the process. Where that whole kind of chief executive recruitment can get a little bit skew is where you don't force that level of alignment at the top of the process.
Yes.
And you get down the path and all of a sudden people have differing opinions or views as to what it is that we're seeking.
Right, there's so much interaction between the CEO and the board of directors, and so much interaction between the CEO and the executive leadership team that they have to work together well, right? They have to fit. to gel?
Look, and I think it's about having the appropriate and delicate balance. You know, from an executive team perspective, it's valuable to have input, but they shouldn't have any accountability or responsibility for making selection decisions.
No.
That's just a little bit awkward.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any sort of common skills that you expect from every CEO that you hire?
There would absolutely be common themes. So, you know, the big piece around strategic acumen and agility is very important. So, the ability to scan and understand what is the operating or competitive environment is really, really critical, and kind of helps inform, you know, the direction of the strategy that is put in place. So that's a big one. Leadership is a big one as well. So, you know, organizational culture, I think, is everybody's responsibility or accountability, because everybody feeds into it, regardless of what role you might have within the business. But you know, there is a buck stopping here dynamic with the chief executive, and so it is important that they are an incredibly visible, very vocal advocate of the organizational culture. And culture is really about leading individuals, leading teams. You know, really defining what is acceptable and not acceptable for the organisation. So there's strategy, there's a leadership piece. There'd be many, many more at a more granular level that we're looking at.
Right.
But really, there are some common broad strokes that would apply.
Right, cool, thank you. Now, you're also involved in many cases in recruiting directors for companies too, right? So, in a similar vein, what kind of commons, now of course the director's position will be very much based on the skills matrix and what the gaps are, so there'll be particular skills that'll be suited to that business. But what are the common themes around skills and experience that you expect in directors?
So I think you make a really good point. I think the starting point for any director search that we run tends to be, okay, what is the competence or capability matrix? So, you know, a board of directors could be anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7 odd people. There's just no point in having 7 carbon copies.
No.
Because, and look, you don't have to look too hard either into the past or actually into the current to see boards that are potentially over-indexed on lawyers and accountants.
Yes.
And that's not a bad, I'm not anti-lawyers or accountants, so it certainly serve a role. But I think, you know, in a modern operating environment, if you identify where potential risk might lie for an organisation, you know, technology is massive. Right?
Absolutely.
And so certainly within New Zealand, you've seen an increased focus on bringing technology capability into a board context because it represents so much risk.
Yes.
You know, diversity of perspective and background, I think, is one thing, but then there's a diversity of lived experience as well. And again, I don't think it's particularly controversial to suggest that, well, there's a huge body of research that would suggest that organisations with greater levels of diversity at a governance and an executive level tend to outperform their peers.
Right.
Yep. You can't help but one's lived experience informing, you know, their worldviews. And you know, I could think of numerous examples of organisations that we've worked with that would have, you know, a workforce that is predominantly female, a customer base that is predominantly female, but that's not reflected at either the executive or governance level.
Right.
Which is a huge opportunity for them, I think. Because I think what you really want around a board is a good level of constructive tension.
Yes.
Yeah. You don't want, to my earlier point, if you've got 7 carbon copies, you're never going to have those rigorous and robust debates around what are the other ways that we could be doing this.
Yes, absolutely. And by diversity, I take it you mean not, you're talking about diversity of gender, diversity of culture, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of background and skill set. Diversity of everything, right?
Yeah. Diversity of age. And
right.
You know, it can get a little bit heated when you talk about affirmative action as or tokenism. You know, these are all issues that need some discussion. But I think the trajectory is a positive one, and I think, you know, having a more diverse collection of people in these kind of conversations is only additive to the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even diversity of age. You know,
yes,
there are some.
That's an interesting one these days, isn't it? You're getting a lot more youths appointed to boards.
Yeah, and look, there are all sorts of kind of board observer or board apprentice programs, either run by the IOD or there's another one called On Board in New Zealand that supports the technology sector, that gives those who might be earlier in their career valuable exposure to a board environment to help bring that next generation of directors through.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But I guess the founding point for any director is an understanding of what the job of a director is.
Yes.
We kind of assume that everyone has to know that, right? But I have been in situations before on boards where you have directors who don't know the job. And it's very important, I think, to get the training and understand and learn what the job is so you can do the job well.
I completely agree, and maybe I glossed over that, but you would have an expectation of a baseline level of capability or competence or awareness as to what you're signing yourself up for.
Yes.
Because, I'm often in conversations with people where I ask them pretty bluntly, why would you want to be a director? And, sometimes people struggle with that answer. Oh, it's just what I thought I did after my career, or trying to get an alignment of personal passion and ambition and aspiration for it, because there are, and I'm sure you're talking to people more capable of commenting on this, but there are significant risks associated with putting yourself in a governance role.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So it shouldn't be it should be. It's not a casual or light undertaking.
Absolutely. Well, moving back to that question about recruiting, what about the role of recruiting an independent chair? Because it's such a key position.
Critical.
What's different about recruiting an independent chair?
So I think, well, I'm not sure what's different, but that chair is really, really critical.
Yes.
So I think when you talk about the chair, there are two dynamics to potentially consider. One is actually the leadership of the board.
Yes.
So again, the hope is that you've got some really capable, maybe not forceful personalities, but some capable, confident individuals on the board.
Yes.
That requires a bit of management, a bit of cat herding, if you will.
Yes.
And I think where I see it done well is somebody who can lead with conviction or authority without dominating the conversation.
Right.
And again, you don't need to look you don't need to look too hard to find people who might have more of a dominating reputation than one of a collaborative reputation.
Yes.
I can reflect on a number of conversations I've had with chairs who, as a rule, speak last because they don't want to be overtly influencing other people's opinions on the board. The other dynamic I think is really important to consider is not only the chair relationship with the board, but the chair relationship with the chief executive.
Yes.
Which is very, very critical. Obviously, the chief executive has a reporting relationship into the entire board, but there needs to be that rapport, the relationship between the chair and the chief executive. And that's a relationship not only of support, but one of constructive challenge again. I think, without anticipating some of your questions that might come, the role of the board, I'm sure you could talk to a lot of people who would say the role of the board is to kind of hire and fire the chief executive.
Yes.
It's often trotted out, and yes, that is a performance management of the chief executive is certainly a big part of it, but I think that might not necessarily be the most contemporary way of considering it. If anything, I think the board should have a real role in helping guide and set strategy, but being that confidant, the challenger, the sounding board to the chief executive and the leadership team as well. The
sounding board, I think, is a particularly nice way of putting it, right? It's they're there to poke and prod and challenge the CEO to an extent to helping and supporting. Have you considered this? Have you considered this? Rather than as an antagonist towards the CEO.
Yes. Antagonistic relationships are seldom good. But reflecting on a conversation I've had in the last couple of months with the chief executive, incredibly supportive board, but the observation was, I just wonder if I'm getting enough challenge from these people.
Right.
Lovely bunch of people, super supportive, great rapport, great relationship, but are they actually pushing me hard enough?
Right.
So I think there's a delicacy of balance to be found there.
Absolutely. And would it be fair to say that for your independent chair, that's kind of a person that really must know the governance job inside out? very, very well.
Yeah, look, yes, it's certainly not a role for a junior director. I think there are some mechanics around how you kind of manage a board meeting appropriately, and that's potentially a bit granular for this conversation. But yes, to be chair, you'd anticipate or expect a significant amount of experience in a director role. It's
interesting the comment you made before about a chair that habitually speaks last. One of the boards that I'm on, we run according to Robert's Rules, which is an old set of rules from the early 20th century that were written around how British Parliament works. And in that's where the concept of moving a motion and seconding and so forth is kind of codified. And one of the points in there is that the chair only casts their vote in the event that their vote will change the decision. And that's often misinterpreted as the chair or whoever it may be having a casting vote, which is a completely different thing and very wrong. The chair should only have one vote, the same as everybody else. But that very much aligned with that concept of speaking last is I'm only going to vote if it's going to switch the decision, if it's going to stop, put it through or not put it through is the only time I vote. And I think it's a really cool parallel with what you said before.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think it was it Harry Truman who had the buck stops here, sign on his desk in the Oval Office. It's an interesting question. I actually referred to it earlier. Does the buck stop with the chief executive? Does the buck stop with the board? Does the buck ultimately stop with the chair?
Yes. Yeah, there's certainly got to be a strong team and have a good working relationship.
Yeah.
So to broaden the conversation a little bit, what is governance?
Ooh. Look, I'm sure there's a textbook definition somewhere in the IOD would probably be really well equipped to provide the textbook definition.
Yeah.
What is governance? I suppose governance is the representation of shareholder interests or stakeholder interests around the performance of an organisation.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. You've got this large body of people, whether it be membership in a not-for-profit or shareholders in a business, and they can't all be involved in the conversation, and in many cases they wouldn't want to be involved in the conversation or wouldn't have the skills to be. So having a representative group to do that on their behalf, that's a great definition. Is the process or role of governance different in any way for a not-for-profit than it is from a profit-making entity?
The pay is different usually.
Yeah, yes.
So there's probably a subtle but significant distinction to make between, in a commercial for-profit enterprise, a listed entity, for example, the board is there very much to represent shareholder interests.
Yes.
In a not-for-profit environment, it's a little bit broader. It's more around stakeholder interests. So they can be much broader than individuals or organisations that hold a literal shareholding in the organisation. I think not-for-profit, the inherent, well, it's not a tragedy, but every organisation kind of survives or fails based on the quality of the capability or talent within the organisation.
Yes.
And what is often really sad to see is that you've got a not-for-profit who has an incredibly admirable mission or purpose, but for whatever reason, whether it's resource or ability, struggles to attract real capability from a governance or an executive perspective.
Yes.
So that's tough.
Yes.
The process to recruit, and we've done a lot of work in the not-for-profit sector, we would apply the exact same process.
Right. Right. Okay.
Because good process gets you the best result.
Yeah.
I think many people look at not-for-profit governance as maybe, well, rightly or wrongly, potentially a stepping stone.
Yes.
To develop some governance experience that might then be applied in a. You're unlikely to, for your first governance role, step on a major listed entity.
No.
Almost. Guarantee that you won't, but hey, you might be on the school board of trustees,
yes, or
you might be sitting on the board of a martial arts organisation, yes, or charity or a disabilities organisation, and there I think you don't want to compromise the capability or talent, but you want to make sure that you're also acknowledging where is the personal interest or passion for the work that this organisation does.
That can often be a challenge for your not-for-profit sector, right? Because many of the people that step into governance roles come from the organisation, and so they're used to having their fingers in the detail. And that whole hands-out requirement of governance becomes very, very difficult for them to do, although they do tend to be more resource-based. The governors of a not-for-profit organisation, because they tend to have smaller ones tend to be leaner in terms of their workforce, the governors do tend to have to do a little bit more work.
Yeah.
But yeah, they do struggle often to get their hands out of the detail.
Yeah, and again, when we work with large corporates and they've got a bit of money or resource to throw at, governance development. So there will be regular board assessment processes. There might be ongoing professional, personal development opportunities. Unfortunately, if you're looking at a small not-for-profit, there just ain't the cash to kind of invest in that type of professional or personal development.
Absolutely.
So
not cheap to do the IID course.
It's not. No, it's not cheap, and so that's a inherent challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Well, a couple of questions in for you about advice. In your career as a recruiter, what's some of the best advice that you've heard or received about moving into an executive role or into a governance role?
How do you do it? Or
what's some of the best advice that you've received or heard? You've been involved in some interesting conversations.
Yeah. I think so. Look, I think professional development is really important to understand the mechanics of it, because that's kind of non-negotiable. And certainly within New Zealand, the Institute of Directors, I think, does a really good job on that front. I think though. You often hear people talk about hard skills and soft skills.
Yes.
The irony being that the soft skills are arguably the much harder competence and capabilities to get better at.
Absolutely.
So I think for anybody embarking on a governance career, having a clear understanding as to why you want to do it is really important.
Yes.
But then having a network of individuals that can help support that development journey for you as well. So whether or not you can find someone to mentor you, whether you could be a protege to somebody, or whether or not even through regular networking events, you can get exposed to different ways of thinking and doing things.
Right.
Because again, even at the chair level, I could reflect on, without too much challenge, 15, 20 chairs that I know, and they would all have slightly different approaches or markedly different approaches to how they would chair that board.
Right.
So there's a baseline of capability, and then there's how do you build confidence in your own personal style and approach?
Yeah, and having, as you say, a network of people that you can talk to, that you can raise challenges with, is very valuable. Well, that's a really cool piece of advice. I like that. Thank you very much, Scott.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciated the conversation. This has been
very painless,
tremendously interesting. Thank you.
Tremendously.
I'll look forward to seeing you.
You'd say.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I'll look forward to seeing you next class.
Brilliant.
And I look forward to seeing you next episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you.